Ladies and gentlemen, viewers and listeners, good evening, and thank you for joining us once again on another edition of Globespan 24/7. My name is Richard Rambarran, and I'll be your host this evening for what will prove to be, in my opinion, a very interesting and, of course, overall a very pertinent topic uh, to the general landscape of all of our lives. The topic this evening is around supply chain, inflation, enterprise, and essentially how it will affect or how it is currently affecting uh, our lives. And more particularly, as it relates to context, we'll be focusing on the Guyanese market and what is intended to happen in the Guyanese market. But then, as a result of Guyana being a part of a global system of trade and a network of complex supply chains, will also be focusing on international market developments. With me this evening, I have a gentleman who is no stranger to Globespan, and I wish to thank him for joining us this evening. Professor Tarron Khemraj. He is a professor of economics and a well-published author and respected scholar in his field. So, Tarron, thank you very much for acquiescing to this interview, and I certainly look forward to hearing your perspectives on this very important topic this evening.
Thank you, Richard, and thanks to Globespan for inviting me to share my views on this most important issue and very topical, which is affecting all of our lives. And I must thank you, Richard, for confidence and the time you placed in me that we will have a great show. And I also thank you for the kind words. I look forward to your questions, and I'd be happy to discuss and answer them as best as I can. This is a very important issue, and it turns out that it's deeply related to economics and business. So I'd be happy to delve into it.
Thank you. Thank you, Taryn. So, Taryn, part of what has been at the forefront of the international conversation over maybe say the past 24 months thereabout has been COVID-19.
Mhm.
And of course, the public health impact and all of the developments occurring as it relates to vaccinations, as it relates to spread, etc. But a large part of what has been, I don't want to say not examined, but perhaps the microscope has not gone as closely as it should be the economic effects of what has been happening in and around the global pandemic. So, of course, we have had in the recent past the economic fallout from social distancing and the physical lockdown of marketplaces. But as we begin to become vaccinated, move closer to herd immunity, and economies begin to open up, we're seeing some very interesting trends emerging. And this is not only as it relates to the Guyanese market, but more generally in an international sense. Can you perhaps shed some light on this topic tonight for our viewers as to what are some of the major developments that we have been tracking in the international economic and business arena that is relevant for giving context to our discussion this evening?
Sure. The COVID-19 is an epidemiological problem. It's a virus that that came about somewhere in China, and it's affected the global economy. And I'm not going to get into the epidemiological aspect of this because that's not my specialty. But it turns out that this this COVID-19 has created major economic disruption around the world and major uncertainty, uh, and in particular, is really at the heart of the high inflation you'll see, or the elevated inflation we're internationally, and I'm sure there is an elevation of it in Guyana. I could get into the mechanism how it happened, but the COVID is what you call the pandemic is an example of a shock. I mean, economists, one of the main preoccupations of economists, especially macroeconomists, one is to study why business cycles occur and why cycles occur. Right? Cycles are basically driven by shocks, and you can have like in 2007, we had one shock because of financial shock crisis led to a major downturn, and then we have the recovery after. Um, and the pandemic created another shock, from the global financial crisis on the pandemic. The United States, for example, had the longest expansion in continual expansion of GDP growth, job creation, and so on, where groups that find it hard to get top paying jobs were starting to be employed and so on. And then the economy was slammed by a pandemic, which then drove the economy down into a very short recession. This pandemic recession was not the same as a financial recession driven by a financial crisis. Um, because in the pandemic, we just decided, okay, we're going to turn off economic activity for 2 weeks or a short while. And then after we pass through and suppress the spread, we'll turn on back economic activity. And that's it's easy said than done. But one of the things that happened in the United States, we haven't talked about the United States because it's the world's dominant economy. Um, One of the things that happened was that we had unprecedented fiscal stimulus, right, at a level that it surpassed the financial crisis. And that played a major role in the very quick recovery in the American economy. Okay. So while the jobs haven't been completely recovered, and there are various reasons for that. I mean, there's all kinds of reasons for why not everyone is back in the labor market, and there have been some structural change. There's a lot of people have decided to retire, just retire because it's the uncertainty of going out to work and fixes and so on with this virus. But generally, the economy is humming along. Stock markets are doing well. Investors are making a lot of money, but we have a big problem, and that problem is the inflation problem. Okay, and it's inflation is an issue that often results in major political upheaval because people don't like inflation, and I think part of it is because people not well understood what drive factors driving inflation, right? And as you might have read, there's this big debate: is the inflation transitory or not transitory? And yeah, and it turns out that I wish it's not possible to give everyone 5 economics courses at the undergraduate level, but a lot of the misconceptions of what transitory means or what it doesn't mean is really driven um, by 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 the lack of people not understanding the inflationary process. And these are not things you can fully understand, and I get that. But so that's really where the problem lies. It's the inflation problem, and it's a huge problem in Guyana, in the Caribbean, United States, and now Europe.
Yeah. Yeah. So, Tarron, inflation essentially, for those who are in business or who are observers of the economy, or even persons who are practitioners, can usually emanate from either the demand side or the supply side. And of course, sometimes it happens on either side, and that would drive prices up. And I think that that's where the debate is around right now, whether that inflation is transitory, like you would have mentioned, or whether it will become more of a permanent feature where prices will remain high and be unable to go down back. Now, how much of the inflation that we're seeing happening right now, and we're seeing it in the United States, and I want to mention also for persons in Guyana, because the United States is our largest trading partner, and China, of course, coming second, we will feel the economic effects of what happens in the United States, whether it's imported inflation or inflation that's domestically created. So, but what I wanted to ask, Tarron, is that from your perspective, how much of that inflation or the inflation that's happening right now is linked to the supply side in terms of the supply chain issues that are happening, the blockage in terms of the containers emanating from the Suez Canal blockage, and then how much of it is attributed to pent-up demand coming out of lockdowns?
Right. So, that's a very good question, and it's not one that we can fully answer until until we do all the research, we do all the estimation, and but we can generally we can have some some formal discussions based on our understanding of how economic structures are. And my personal view is the inflation is really driven by supply side factors, okay, not so much demand factors. And I will argue why that is so. Um, what we're seeing, so what we, the reason, so with the COVID basically caused the disruption of supply chain, and one of the reasons why that happened, it's a policy known as zero COVID, right? Particularly in China, right? And zero COVID means that even if you have a small outbreak in a particular location, you shut down major areas, right? Including ports. So workers cannot go out. Um, and what that did um, was slow down the ships and uh, leaving, and of course, then when we get to the United States, we also have drivers and truck drivers and are basically not available um, or are not willing to go out to work because of being uncertain of being scared. And so you have ships are lined up waiting to get to port and so on. And now the factor is, the question is where the demand is going to come from, right? And one of the other things that COVID did was it when you have the supply disruption, you basically have a cost push factors, right? And 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 so that really caused the inflation to emanate mainly from supply side. Now, some people have said, and I mean, the verdict is still out, that the unprecedented stimulus, particularly in the U.S., which gave a lot of money to people who lose their jobs and so on, and rent subsidies and so on for extended period, um, unemployment benefits for extended period, contributed to the higher demand during the pandemic, right? So not only did we have a supply side shock, we also had a demand side shock. I'm not fully convinced of that, and I might be wrong when people, people are going to write theses and dissertations just for years to come, but because I am not so sure that people go out, especially lower income people, will go out on a spending binge, right? With 4 months or 6 months rent, right? So subsidy, because if you lose your job, well, you have a lot of uncertainty in your life. You're trying to survive, right? Um, so what what happened is we had a shift in demand from the physical stores to the online, and this is really what caused a lot of the disruptions. Whether overall demand changed, I think the verdict is still out, but we definitely had a shift in the in delivery businesses, and that's where we did not have enough workers, whether it's truck drivers, more fulfillment centers, finding workers, and all of that. And of course, it's not only the goods coming from Asia which were disrupted. Even within the U.S., you have major disruptions to to farmers and farms, right? Um, Farm laborers, a lot of on the ground workers, which in the U.S., we say, uh, off the book workers. A lot of them went back to Mexico and other places in Latin America. And what's actually not discussed a lot is that even before the pandemic, there was a starting to be a reversal of migration, right? There was starting to be a shortage of construction workers in the U.S. It could be a combination of Trump's rhetoric against Latin, particularly Mexicans, but because of the improvements in the Mexican economy, there was actually a movement back of labor to Mexico. And so you had a compounding of all these supply side shocks, right? The tariffs is an example of a supply side shock, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Tariff, right? That's definitely a copy. One of the worst economic policies one can implement is a tariff on intermediate goods, right? It's
Yeah.
like imagine the Guyana government decides we're going to put a tariff on oil on gasoline, right? That's an intermediate good. Not only does it go into final consumption, so many businesses depend. But this is what the Trump administration did: is to put a tariff on steel. You know, I mean, if you're going to put a tariff, well, okay, if you put a tariff on wine and cheese, is a different story, right? I mean, I'm supporting it, but um, partly because I like French wine, but that's a different discussion. But that's not as damaging to the economic situation as putting tariffs on on, on intermediate goods, right? Because steel and aluminum, these things go into every other many industries, right? So there was a compounding of cost pressures, right? And then the pandemic broke, and then corporations and businesses decide we're going to just have to something is going to have to give. We're going to have to increase prices. Now, one of the things we should note, though, which is related, but although wages are on the rise in the U.S., which is a good development, um, corporate profit is at all-time high. It's never been as high as it is right now after the pandemic, right? It's been an uptrend, right? So corporations can actually pay more and earn more, which is there's an interesting economic theory along the line, by the way. So it might be a combination of demand and supply, but I would largely argue it's mainly a supply side issue right now.
Yeah, I would tend to support that argument that we need to observe more carefully the supply side of the economy and what really is happening. Because you mentioned an interesting point about Trump's implementation of tariffs. And if one followed the developments very closely, we would know that he would have announced almost a drop dead date on which the tariffs would have been announced, on which the tariffs would have taken effect. So what that did essentially, it effectively front loaded a lot of the imports where persons were trying to get a lot of goods into the United States
Correct.
before the implementation of the tariffs. And of course, that created its own pressures in terms of the supply side on the demand for containers, the demand for shipping, etc. And all of what happened, and then compounded by the Suez Canal blockage and the fact that decisions had to be made there that really tied up global supply chains. It really is, if you want to say, the perfect storm of all types of activities that have caused this situation. But Tarron, importantly, because of the fact that this is supply side, I am not sure that we will see lowering of prices in the near term. I'm not sure that we will see any form of drop in prices, because when you look at what's happening, many of these factors, sure, it may decline a bit somewhat, because in some cases we do have price gouging happening by some of the shipping lines. But effectively, I think higher prices are here to stay, because of what's happening, and then because of the risks associated with the global market now coming out of COVID, or with all the emergence of these variants. One of the other things too, Taryn, that I find very interesting that's happening is this concept that has been talked about, particularly as it relates to more developed labor markets. And that's the concept of the great resignation, or all of these workers that are just resigning as a result of COVID-19, and how sucky they realize some of their jobs are. What has this done in terms of course, the labor market, its linkage to the output market, and then consequentially inflation?
Yes. I mean, before I answer that, I want to go back to a point you made about elevated and sustained higher prices or inflation, right? Remember, inflation is the rate of growth of the price level, right? It's so if that percentage rate of growth, which used to be like 1.2% prior to the crisis, it's now 5% on average in the US. Um, the question is, does it stay at Y5%? Does it get higher? Does it come down back? Regardless of what has happened, the price level is getting higher. I think you are right that there is going to be higher periods of prices going forward, or elevated inflation. But I don't think it's really because of COVID, and I'll tell you what I feel. I think it's because of geopolitics. See? Um, because while supply chain structures are, the just-in-time method, which is the whole supply chain model, right, is based on the just-in-time method, right? And so the thing is that it means that you can really produce components somewhere in the rest of the world, and then once you have a very efficient shipping system and so on, you can get that goods in your factory quickly. You don't have to worry about having a lot of warehouses, because you save on storage and inventory costs, right? Holding inventory is a cost, right? Um, and that can only work if there is political cooperation between the two hegemons of the world, China and the United States. And I believe that there is going to be not a complete divorce, but there is going to be a partial disengagement of the economies of the US and China. It's going to happen definitely in microprocessors. There's no ifs and buts. The US will start to produce more of its microprocessors at home. China will have to become self-sufficient. If it wants to be a power, have to be self-sufficient in microprocessors. It's no ifs and buts, right? So that's one example. But I can see that unless we are able to crack up supply chains in Bangladesh, Vietnam, and India at the rate that China was able to provide, we're going to have higher prices. Okay, and or elevated inflation. I don't think it's going to get significantly worse. I see inflation coming back down to probably 2.5% for a sustained period, perhaps 3%, not the 1.2%. So in that sense, inflation is transitory in my view, because if inflation is rising and it comes back to another equilibrium, that's a transition to another equilibrium. It's transitory, right? To use of technical terms. But so yes, I feel that this political disentanglement is going to be an issue that will hurt consumers to some extent going forward. I feel that a lot of people will use the pandemic as the excuse to blame for this entanglement. Okay, um, and and of course, when you disentangle with trade, the world becomes a more unstable place and a more dangerous place. I mean, trade is one of the things that keeps you trade goods or you trade bullets, right? Um, so I feel that's going to be a very that's a factor that we have to consider. Prior to the pandemic, the problem was low inflation, right? To the extent that we could have deflation, what some economists call secular stagnation, right?
Yeah.
And secular stagnation came about, as some people would say, because the stimulus were not as large um, during after the financial crisis as it should have been, right? As the pandemic crisis, you know. If anything, perhaps the pandemic crisis didn't need such a large stimulus because financial crises do engender much more harmful recessions, right? And obviously depression. The whole third phase depression was triggered by financial crisis in 1929, and then a combination of various factors after that that prolonged it. But it was triggered by a financial crisis, and financial crisis can be very damaging.
Yeah.
Um, but to answer your question of the labor market situation, yes, the great resignation has disrupted supply labor and increase because so as I said, the zero COVID policy is one factor, but we also have a shortage of labor and a mismatch of labor because, as I said, demand shifted from stores to online, and you take some time to readjust the labor market to get from that sector to the other sector. But the Great Resignation has caused major shortage of labor, and and so and so we've lost probably 2 million workers, and that's one of the reasons why labor costs have gone up so high. And it's a good labor market if you're a young person, particularly if your major is like computer science or economics or finance and these majors. Um, but it's definitely contributing to higher costs because labor costs, some of it is passed on to higher prices. So you definitely have, and there is another factor, as I said, a lot of construction workers were going back to Latin America,
Yeah.
Mexico in particular. And of course, there has been a major slowdown in immigration in the US coming out from the Trump years. And I think the United States will find itself that because it doesn't graduate enough STEM graduates, it's going to have to open up the H-1B programs. But it's going to have to be regulated better because obviously there were abuses with the H-1Bs, but obviously it's going to have to do that to ease some of these technical problems that are coming down.
So Tarron, now just before we wrap up this segment in terms of dissecting some of the international developments and starting to bring it a bit more to Guyana's developments, one more thing I wanted to ask is that oil and oil prices, of course, play an extraordinarily important role in the direction of any economy and the state of economic activity because, of course, oil is a commodity that's imputed into so many production lines, supply chains, value chains, etc. How important has the higher oil prices been in driving some amount of this increased price level? And then how effective do you think this alliance that Joe Biden has recently announced of himself and other countries are releasing oil to lower the prices? How effective do you think that'll be in bringing some of this international price level down?
Well, the price really the release of has largely been, at least in the short term, analysts believe you have to give it some time, perhaps next year. But already the National Energy Agency, right? They were forecasting that there's going to be a surplus of oil next year, regardless. So um, now, of course, the oil price increased because of the pickup in the global economy. Fairly quick pickup, right? I mean, in economic activities in the U.S. and internationally. I mean, unfortunately for the Caribbean, you may not have had this fast pickup, but for various structural reasons, your small economies and so on. But the big economies have done really well after the pandemic, So you had this increase in oil prices again in the last few days. Oil price collapse largely because of the scare of the new variant of coming out of South Africa and so on, which I mean, I'm not an expert in that field, but from the readings I've done, I think the fears are overblown. It's going to be fine. The vaccines are going to be mostly effective against it, but um, so oil prices are definitely about affected because of the coming out of the recession, and recently it's been affected by the the fears over the new the new strain, Omicron, right? So the how does this influence Guyana, though? I mean, it's a two-sided, it's a double-edged sword, right? On the one hand, high oil prices will mean that Guyana benefits from more revenues going to the government, which more revenue goes into the oil funds at the Federal Reserve. On the other hand, high oil prices mean you have to pay more to import fuels and lubricants, right? Particularly gasoline and heavy fuels and so on. So you have this double effect in Guyana. So, and I think the net so far is a negative effect because Guyana has to import a lot of fuels. This is definitely room for policy, and the policymakers definitely have to start thinking about the types of vehicles and should be um, should be encouraged and so on. How you can structure homes and build homes and light homes and so on to reduce the demand side here, right? It's not just building a hydro. I mean, I'd like to see a lot more focus on the demand side in Guyana. So yes, I mean, oil prices are blessing, and it's a problem for a place like Guyana. Right? In the past, of course, this is an net improvement because in the past it was mainly a problem, right? High oil prices, at least high oil prices means you have a net out effect. Now you're getting more money in the oil funds. So, but perhaps when Guyana gets up to a million barrel, it might be a net positive.
Yeah, yeah. So, Aaron, I'm just getting a signal here. I think that this is an appropriate time for us to go to a short break before we begin to delve into the pertinence of all of this to the Guyanese economy, and why, of course, it is important for Guyana, and how we can actually track some of this within the Guyanese context and what to expect. So, Devin, take it away to a break.
The curry roti box is now available. Select your meal. Choose from chicken, duck, goat, or lamb curries, plus pepper pot, chicken tikka masala, lamb vindaloo, and roti. Your choice and your selection. Make up your own curry roti box. We will ship directly to your home or job. Unbox your favorite curries, rotis, pastries, plus order your favorite West Indian sodas and much, much more on allfromonesupplier.com. Treat yourself or send a curry roti box as a gift. Curry roti box is available with free shipping to all U.S. states and free delivery in New York. Order now your favorite curries, your fish, meats, pastries, sodas, and much more. Get all your West Indian and Indian food, plus your West Indian groceries from allfromonesupplier.com. It's free delivery and free shipping. Log on to allfromonesupplier.com and place your order today or call 718-551-3292. Again, that's allfromonesupplier.com. This is a save the date announcement. Couples, family, relatives, and friends, save the date. We are taking our culture, music, and food on our vacation in 2022. Enjoy a vacation plus special events and entertainments. Here are the choices: Guyana excursion May 4th to May 11th, Indian talent competition July 14th to July 18th in Punta Cana, Dominican Republic, Christian Community Week July 21st to July 25th in Punta Cana, Dominican Republic, Curry Duck Curry competition July 28th to August 1st in Cancun, Mexico, Caribbean Week August 4th to August 8th in Punta Cana, Dominican Republic, Battle for the DJ Crown Soca, Indo, and Chutney style August 11th to August 15th. Enjoy 5 days plus 4 nights all-inclusive vacation with your own cultural music, food, and entertainment. Meet and greet sessions with the performers and competition prizes. First place prize $2,000, second place $1,500, and third place $1,000. This is a save the date announcement by Travelspan. More information will become available in December. Travelspan, always on the cutting edge and serving you for over 27 years. Call 718-845-0437. That's 718-845-0437.
Thank you for staying with us this evening, viewers and listeners, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for staying attuned to us. So, with me, as I would have mentioned, if you're now joining us, I have Professor Tarron Khemraj, a professor of economics uh, in the United States. And I, of course, this evening with him, we're discussing supply chain, what's been happening with that, a little bit about COVID and its economic effects, inflation, and generally what the implications are for business. Now, Taran, we have been hearing, for example, in the U.S. that even the president of the United States has had to announce that no need to worry, there will be things in the supermarkets and stocked in the shelves for Thanksgiving, and of course that did manifest. But in Guyana, how or what can we expect the impact of this international development of supply chain crunch and inflation, and this kind of thing? How can we have expected to impact on the Guyanese economy?
Well, there might not have been a shortage Thanksgiving, but I can tell you there is starting to be a shortage for the Christmas season. Pet foods are hard to come by. Um, some basic consumer goods are hard to come by, and trying to get a new car is not that easy, right? It's one of the reasons why the inflation rate went up so high in the U.S., right? Because when you can't get a new car, the price of used cars go up, and the used cars are a major part of this consumer price index. This is how one of the ways they calculate it, right? So the U.S. is being affected by shortages. I would think that this would be a problem in the Guyana and the Caribbean. And so, in addition to having to pay more for goods, uh, I can, there are reports of higher prices, higher, which is coming out because of the higher transport costs, um, in particular. And of course, the similar problems, the higher, if you have shortages of workers elsewhere in the world, but ultimately all of that con- contribute to higher costs for places like Guyana to import. So I would see if I would not be surprised you have some shortages, and of course it's not really the fault of you're it's an economy that is highly open. It's operating in a global economy. You have major global shocks. It's not really, what are you going to do? The most you can do is make sure you cushion the effects on your people, right? You're the government, but it's really not the fault of the government per se. We're not hearing you.
Yeah, sorry about that. One of the very first things, of course, Taryn, that you learn in business school or in economics classes is that countries like Guyana are small, open economies that generally tend to be international price takers. So, of course, we can anticipate in Guyana, and you're already beginning to see it in some small way, that this degree of inflation that is persisting in the US, which is of course resulting in higher prices, will tend to be imported into Guyana. So that's something I think that Guyanese consumers may have to brace themselves for. Of course, the government of the day has recognized that. I think His Excellency has been on record as saying some of these things. And hence we've seen some moves, I think, by the administration to cut excise taxes, for example, on fuel, with a view to helping to stabilize and regulate some amount of the prices, understanding the wider effect that fuel has.
Yeah, and basic manufacturers, I mean, consumer durables are a lot more expensive now. TVs are more expensive. You know, electronics are more expensive. Washing machines, refrigerators. So you'll see some of this with elevated prices. Hopefully, gonna level up to a new level, and then it will not continue to rise. Or well, that becomes a major problem going forward, where you no longer are in a situation of transitory inflation, but you're starting to have permanently higher inflation, which is a big problem, and it leads to serious disruptions. One of the things to note, however, in the case of Guyana, which might be due to the fact that you have more foreign exchange coming in now because of the oil and all of that, and the investors are pouring money in, at least for now, is the exchange rate appears to me to be fairly stable, right? I mean, when I try the daily rate, when I track it, it's not. As a matter of fact, it might have appreciated slightly from a year, 18 months ago, even. And so, what that means is it could ease some of the pressures, cushion some of the pressure, because it will be a double whammy where you're having to pay higher prices for these consumer durables I mentioned, as I said, washing machines or microwaves, and microwave oven, and so on. And at the same time, you have a depreciating exchange rate. That would be a double whammy, right? I think the fact that the exchange rate has stabilized is actually a blessing right now in this environment. So
Yeah.
let's hope it continues along that line.
So, of course, part of that appreciation effect on the exchange rate is stemming from what we have here in terms of the development of the oil and gas sector. But that, of course, and this is where it begins to get a little bit tricky within the Guyanese context, because that, of course, is influencing the stabilization of the exchange rate, which otherwise would have slid. Um, but to some extent, it's driving a domestic form of inflation in Guyana, because the entire development of the oil and gas sector is naturally causing prices to rise even outside of any international condition. So when one looks at, for example, rental prices in Georgetown, Guyana, it's almost it's highly improbable and almost impossible for you to find a property which is being rented at the same price for maybe say 2015.
Right.
Of course, we've had some tremendous flooding this year, which has contributed to some degree of higher prices as it relates to food and other crop production. And that, of course, has had an impact too on livestock because of the continuity and the life cycle of livestock. So I think those are some of the domestic features which really put the inflationary scenario and the price levels in Guyana to be in somewhat of a precarious situation. So we are having this offsetting effect of the exchange rate, in my opinion, for imported goods. But then we're having the same generator of that offsetting effect also causing some amount of domestic inflation. So in that case, what would you say the best approach would be at this point to help to stabilize some of that? Let's say if you were in the central bank, or if you were in the finance ministry, with your understanding of economics, what would you be saying to do at this point?
I mean, absolutely. What you're basically saying is that um, the inflation in Guyana, and which is not a good situation to be in, is driven both by international events, which we've spent the first half of this show discussing, and local conditions driven by the boom in the oil sector. And rent is a major part of it, right? Um, and of course that is compounded by the fact that you had floods, and and floods will be a recurring feature in Guyana right now. Um, as climate change continues. So those are structural, two supply side and one demand side factor there, right there, right? So and what can be done? The central bank could use some macroprudential, some in this case microprudential regulations, start to target real estate prices, right? Not just target the exchange rate, but you can probably start looking at price targeting of particularly as it relates to rental, right? And in collaboration with the Ministry of the Treasury or the Ministry of Finance, you will have to think about providing some kind of relief, not just relief, but some kind of mechanisms to deal with this. Those are the short-term approaches. These are mainly long-term issues, and as the oil sector grows, we can expect more and more of this to occur, which means that something's got to be done about housing, right? To me, a lot of the housing is driven by getting everyone to be a homeowner, right? And that's a noble objective. But what seems to be the problem is that a lot of people are constrained in some way, whether it's credit or can't get the land, although that's not, I mean, people are getting land, but, or there is some constraint on building the house, right? And if that's the case, where do people live in the interim, right? So it seems to me the rental market is not working well, and this is really where microprudential policies can be important, not macroprudential, but microprudential policies. And I am, and so the rental market is a big problem. I agree, and you have to look at it by some short-term factors, and but mainly long-term factors.
Yeah. So I
And
want to say two things really we're seeing happening here in Guyana. One is that massive increase in rental prices, particularly in the urban spaces, and then also the urban food prices. And I tell people, when you want to have a good indicator of inflation, or what is a leading indicator for inflation, is to observe very closely what's happening with urban food prices, because that is where the pressure tends to come from first. But Tarron, of course, we have been talking here about inflation quite a bit, and you made a point there. I just don't want to ignore it before we go forward. I think this is where too the international supply chain crisis is having a problem in Guyana in terms of expansion of home ownership, in terms of steel, in terms of shipping costs, etc. Because I'm going to give you an example. If I go through a loan process, and in the loan process, I go for maybe say 15 or 20 million Guyana dollars to purchase a home or to erect a home. I'm going to go build a home. Now, I may not time it the same time that stock of steel that's coming in will have that stable price. I might time it for it to have a particular price. But by the time my mortgage is approved, and by the time I'm going to the supplier of those hardware materials to obtain it, I'll find that it has increased in price. And that in itself is causing a variance between, that time lag is causing a variance in between what persons are actually obtaining for loans and then what they effectively have to spend. So this is where a critical juncture lies in terms of the supply chain, what's obtaining here locally, the rental market, and such the like. One other thing that I want us to just explore a bit is what effect is this inflation or potential inflationary situation in Guyana having or going to have, or what's it going to have on the competitiveness of our country as it relates to perhaps regional economies like Trinidad and Tobago that benefit from subsidized electricity and a more mature capitalist economy?
Yes, you can. It will definitely have an adverse effect on competitiveness because let's start with the tradable sector, right? Your tradable sectors are the places that are exporting, whether it's from manufacturer or the sugar sector, the rice sector, and all of these. And as their cost of production increases, they're going to face pressure to increase prices. Now, if you're a basic commodity producer like a rice miller, well, you really don't have a lot of wiggle room, right? To increase prices in the global economy, right? Now, if you have a unique good, let's say DDL or Bank CI, they do have some unique products, whether it's the Eldorado or the XM brands, which are really, it's not something to joke about. This is how you build inelasticity, right?
Yeah.
And these guys over the decades have some good products, and they will actually be able to pass on some of their prices and not face the consequence. Because I can tell you that there is room for increasing the Eldorado 15 price, for example, in the US, and you probably will still get people to buy it, right? Um, and so, because there's really not many good competitors, I mean, there are a few good ones, but they're mainly, you have to get something that's as good as the 15, you need to pay like $120 for the one coming out of, I forgot the name, coming out of Guatemala, right? Or Puerto Rico, right? So those are the guys who will have some pricing power, but you can expect that it will have a major effect on competitiveness. That's the tradable sector, right? In the non-tradable sector, you mentioned rentals, right? Well, rentals and all these things, although we're not exporting rentals, rental properties, but it is going to have spillover effects to the tradable sector, right? And this is really one of the big problems of inflation. I mean, is that it does affect your competitiveness. So it's a lot of it.
So, Tarron, one thing, and just as a follow up to that before we move on to another tangential area, is this a precursor or a beginning to the famous Dutch disease or natural resources curse?
Um, well, you can't say. I mean, the inflation is not completely driven by, as we've confessed that, as we've conceded, it's not completely driven by the oil sector. Yes, it's partially driven by the oil sector. You've given one example of the rental properties, which is a major component of the consumer price index. But a lot of the inflation is imported inflation. So we can't say that this is a purely a natural resource course issue. The dust disease, as I've said on several occasions, this is a point that I have made, but other people have not really, because they think of it more in a more orthodox terms. But I am actually not fearful of the dust disease in the context of Guyana. As a matter of fact, I feel some appreciation of the exchange rate. I'm not suggesting to go to 50 to 1, of course, but I think some a marginal appreciation of the Guyana dollar against the US dollar is not a problem. So I'm not too worried about that. Um, my view of the natural resource first is it's not really it playing out through the channels we are talking about here, whether it's through rental rates going up, labor costs going up, competitiveness. My view is mainly the political channel, right? And this is really where I see it playing out. Because the structural reforms, the only way you can address these things over a 5 year period is you need structural reforms. And I mentioned microprudential policies, the central bank. That's a short-term solution. But what you need are structural changes and structural reforms. Like, for example, you need to have a situation where both sides of the political divide agree on a set of priorities that we should not be arguing over. Right? We should have buying. No side should say and thump their chest. Oh yeah, I built the bridge. You didn't build the bridge. That's you're setting yourself up to get resistance the minute you go down that road, right? You need structural reforms, like addressing some of the problems with rental. Let me give you one example. If you can get the bridge done, get it done and get it done fast and properly, where it actually eases up the traffic congestion, you will address some of that rental pressure, right? Because you cut the time to travel into the city significantly. That's a structural change, right? So, but the minute one side wants to show that I'm going to do this in time for 2025 and I will go take it to the voters, it's me, right? Now you can do that if you're in South Korea, right? That's not a problem in South Korea, perhaps the United States. But Guyana is a different society, right? So you need buy-in. I don't think we should be arguing over the bridge. We should not be arguing over Amila, although I have views on when it should be built and how it should be supplying electricity, whether it should be coming down to Linden and Georgetown. I think that's a problem, but a different discussion. We should have buying on things like gas for sure, because the last I checked, the APNO, the PNC also had a plan for gas. So if we can have buy-in over these issues, let's take these issues out of contestation and let's contest over other matters, right? And unless we fix these things, and these things are not going to get fixed that easily unless we have political consensus. So this is how I see the natural resource, not the Dutch disease. This is how I see the natural resource first playing out through the political channel, because right. It's just not. We can quarrel how much we want and pout and moan. Oh, we're getting sabotaged and that. It's just the system is set up such that one side can't make the other side win because it's too costly to lose, right?
So Tarron's comments there have taken us into some realms which we perhaps don't have enough time to be able to explore this evening. But Tarron, certainly we have a rich amount of information there where we can host a follow-up show, because I think we really need to have a discussion on this platform about the gas, the energy. We also really need to have a discussion on this platform about Dutch disease or the natural resource curse and how we can avoid it. What does that mean for Guyana and that kind of thing? And we also do need to have a discussion on what are some of those reforms that we can make structurally to the economy to ensure that there is stable as well as sustainable economic growth. But just tracking back a little bit to where we are with this topic, before we wrap up this evening. Of course, we have Christmas, which is upon us in a couple of days, just about 24 days away now. What are 2-3 things, Tarron, that the average consumer or someone who is not maybe versed in what's happening internationally and so on, what are about 2 or 3 things that consumers can consider for Christmas and maybe entering into 2022?
Well, my advice would be this. If you can't find the good that you really want, Sit down with with the child or children. Sit down with the spouse and say, "Hey, man, we can't find this stuff. I know the only way we can get it, we have to pay a ton of money. I suggest you save that money instead. All right, save it. Perhaps call up one of your brokers and buy some stocks and let it sit for 2 years or something. Um, you know, and that's actually, as a matter of fact, that's what. If I can't find things, I'm not stressing. I'm just going to log in and buy some more stocks. All right. So I think people should think about saving some money as well. If you can find the goods, that's great. If you can do all the gifting, um, and but people should not beat themselves up if you cannot find, because it's you don't do yourself any good and you don't do the society as a whole any good, because it doesn't make sense to put more pressure on prices. I'd say it's important to 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 think carefully about trade-offs. If you have to spend this amount for Christmas, well then, what do I have to give up next year? I think that's a does it mean that I can't get that bike that's important for me to go to work or ride to work? Um, so save, think about, it might be a blessing in disguise, these good shortages, right? Because eventually these things will clear up. These are not things that will exist forever. COVID is going to go away. I am optimistic that the new variety is not going to be as bad. I think the vaccines are going to be effective. And my third advice would be, if you haven't gotten your vaccine, get your vaccine, because you want to live to see another day. It's really not true what you're reading on, whether it's YouTube, what you're hearing on YouTube or Facebook. The vaccines are safe. They're extremely effective. It is not true that these vaccines were just concocted over a weekend, especially the new ones from Pfizer and Moderna. Um, the basic research that went into these things started from the 1960s. So these things did not just come about like that. I am happy to say that I got my vaccines and I'm boosted. So of course, you got to be prepared to get the third shot. You might be sick for 2 nights. That's fine. It's like a short-term cost for a long-term gain. It's like, you don't find the Christmas goods, just save your money, man. Come on.
Yeah, absolutely. So Tarron, it seems as if this may not necessarily be a Christmas where one should splurge. Your advice and by all accounts also my advice is that spending this Christmas ought to be measured. It ought to be carefully considered because of the period in which we're living in, where uncertainty reigns so supreme. Markets are changing very rapidly, and essentially you will be seeing much higher prices this Christmas, perhaps over and above what higher prices or what degree of increase you would have seen in previous years. Because I can't imagine what we'll have in terms of the supply side increases that we're having. And then when there is some amount of pickup in the demand for Christmas shopping. So if you are going to do some shopping, do your shopping early. If you find that you're coming down to the latter part of the holiday season and you haven't gotten your items and you seem to be unable to, perhaps start thinking about some do-it-yourself alternatives. Perhaps think about, maybe some experiences like traveling in your country or in your area that you can do, as opposed to perhaps purchasing commodities and commodity goods. But essentially, Taryn, my view is similar to yours, that this Christmas may be one where it's a little bit different. You may have to have some amount of measured spending and really smart approaches in the way that you do these types of spending around Christmas.
Yeah,
Um,
I agree with you. I completely agree with you. This is actually was on my mind to mention. Um, is if you really wanna, if you don't find some physical good to buy and you really wanna spend some money, it might not be a bad idea to go take your family or take some friends who are vaccinated. You're safe and you travel around Guyana, see the country, go out to the Essequibo coast, spend the 2 nights here, or go out to Sheldon or go in the interior. I mean, you can move around the coast. I mean, so that might be a better way to spend some money and benefit the business folks as well. Um, so that's
Yeah. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to almost an hour and 10, 12, almost 15 minutes of discussion this evening with Professor Khemraj, Professor of Economics. We have been, of course, discussing this evening the supply chain issues that have been happening, inflation, a bit about COVID-19 and the economic effects, and then, of course, the business environment. We have, throughout this program, given you some international context, what's been happening with the markets and some developments there. And then we've attempted to apply some of it in a cursory way to Guyana. Of course, I wish to thank Professor Khemraj for taking the time out of his busy schedule to join us. Tarron, please don't be a stranger to this program, or at least to me hosting the program here. I'm happy to hear your perspectives, and I'm very sure that our audiences are here this evening. So with that, folks, I want to wish you all a very Merry Christmas. I think that the next time you'll be seeing me, maybe in the new year on this program, not for Christmas, not for this month again. So I wish to bid you all a very Merry Christmas. Best wishes to you for the new year. And I also want to urge you throughout the Christmas season to stay safe. Ensure that you are fully vaccinated. If you're fully vaccinated, get your booster shots. And I wish you and your family all the best. Tarron, thank you so much to the team at
you're
Globespan. Thank you very much for all your support this year. And I wish you also, folks, all the best. So
same to
thank you
you.
and
Same
good
to you. I
evening.
wish you all the best for the holidays. Safe, be safe. Thank you for the invitation. When I have time, I'm always happy to come on. And I'd like to express my thanks to Globespan for putting together this show. Safe night to everyone and safe weeks ahead.
Thank you. Thank you.